This is the lecture on the first part of the skeletal system, which will include information on bones in general, and then the axial skeleton, and that's the skull and the vertebrae, the backbone. So, and then what we'll do is for the next unit, we'll do the appendicular skeleton, which is the limbs, the arms, the legs, and the joints. Okay, so starting here, the skeletal system is actually made up of bones of the skeleton, as you probably know, and then it also consists of cartilage and joints, ligaments, and connective tissue that stabilize or connect bones to each other. So, but primarily, the skeletal system is the bones of the skeleton. We find cartilage sometimes at the ends of the bones, and we will study joints. We will go over joints in the next unit. Ligaments connect bones to bones. So, and they don't say it here, but tendons connect bone to muscle. The functions of the skeletal system are support. The skeletal system supports the body. Storage of minerals and lipids. You may already know that bone tissue stores calcium. It also stores phosphorus, and the yellow bone marrow stores lipids or fat for energy reserves. And your body would use that only if you were starving. And then blood cell production. The red bone marrow is where red blood cells, white blood cells, and other platelets are produced in the red bone marrow. Protection, for example, the skull protects the brain, the ribs protect the heart and lungs. Leverage. So your muscles, in order to move your body, the different parts of your body, the muscles have to have something to push against. So the bones serve as levers for the muscles to push against, and that's what enables you to move. Name the 5 primary functions of the skeletal system. So it's support, protection, mineral storage, that's 3, movement, I can't remember. Okay, leverage, not movement. Leverage, protection, support, storage of mineral, blood cell production. There we go. All right. So bone tissue is also called osseous tissue. Osseous tissue. It is a supporting connective tissue. Remember in chapter 4, when we learned the different tissue types, bone is a connective tissue. The supporting connective tissue, and cartilage is as well. So it contains cells that are enclosed within a matrix or surrounded by a matrix. The cells, bone cells, are called osteocytes, which means bone cell. The matrix of bone tissue contains calcium phosphate, which is a calcium salt, and that calcium phosphate accounts for almost 2/3 of the weight of the bone. That calcium phosphate is going to form the cement-like or hard substance of the matrix. But there also, within the calcium salts, are protein fibers. And primarily it is collagen. And about 1/3 of bone weight comes from collagen fibers. So 2/3 comes from calcium phosphate, 1/3 from collagen fibers. I know those questions are in your quiz. Classifying bones by shape. So long bones are going to be the bones of your arms and legs. They're longer than they are wide. The example that's given here is the humerus, which is your upper arm bone. And short bones are about as wide as they are long. So the carpals, which are the wrist bones, and the tarsals, which are the ankle bones, are short bones. Then you can have flat bones An example of a flat bone is the parietal bone, the parietal bones in the skull that form the skull. And they're not flat and straight, but just they're very thin, thin and flat, even though they're curved. Um, irregular bones would be like your vertebrae. They have complex shapes. So here's one that's an irregular bone. And here's the picture blown up a little bigger. The humerus is the upper arm bone. That would be a long bone. The short bones are like the wrist and the ankle bones. And the bones of the skull are flat bones. So that would be an example of flat bones. And irregular would be your vertebrae that form your backbone. We're going to discuss the features of a long bone, not so much the other shapes of bone, but just a long bone, just because of time. The central shaft of the bone, the longest part that's in the middle between the two kind of enlarged ends, is called the diaphysis. And the diaphysis contains a marrow cavity or medullary cavity. And this is a misspelling. The A doesn't need to be there. And it's filled with bone marrow. Bone marrow. And the ends of the bone are called the epiphyses. Each end is called an epiphysis. These are the expanded ends, the larger ends, and they are covered with articular cartilage. And that's just hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of the bones because they're going to come together with another bone to form a joint. So that cartilage is to protect the ends of the bone from being worn down. Here's another misspelling. That's no, that was right. I'm sorry. It is articulate. But articulate just means that, like, the two bones that come together to form a joint. That means that's what articulate means, is to come together with another bone and form a joint. So here's the structure of the long bone. You can see in the middle the diaphysis, and then the ends are epiphyses. And for this bone, which is the humerus, remember proximal and distal are words that are relative to a joint, a major joint, like the shoulder joint. So the end that is close to the shoulder joint is called the proximal epiphysis. And then the end that is furthest from the shoulder joint is called the distal epiphysis. Okay? Now, at both ends, you have articular cartilage. You have articular cartilage here, and you have articular cartilage here. And the articular cartilage is going to protect the bone from being worn away. It's just extra protection for your bone. Now, the epiphyses are going to be filled with bone that we call spongy bone and blood vessels. And then the diaphysis contains the marrow cavity or the medullary cavity, and it contains compact bone. And the outside layer of the bone is called the periosteum. It has a fibrous layer and a cellular layer. It says outer surface of the bone is covered by periosteum, which has a cellular layer and a fibrous layer. So the cellular layer can form new bone tissue. Those cells can divide and form new bone cells. But this periosteum isolates the bone from surrounding tissue, and it forms attachments with the tendons and the ligaments. Remember, the tendons connect bone to muscle, and ligaments connect bone to bone. The inner surface of the marrow cavity is actually spongy bone, and that spongy bone is covered by an endosteum. That's just the lining of the inner surface of the marrow cavity. And it functions during bone growth and repair. We'll talk about that soon. Now, the dense, thick bone is compact bone, is relatively solid, and you find compact bone in the walls of the diaphysis. even though the very inner lining is going to be spongy bone, the majority of the diaphysis is composed of compact bone. Now, spongy bone is also called cancellous bone, and it's called spongy because there are a lot of air holes in it, so it's much lighter in weight. The epiphyses are filled with spongy bone, and the marrow cavity lines it. Spongy bone lines the marrow cavity. Okay, bone cells are called osteocytes. Now, each one of these this is an osteocyte. Okay, so that one and that one, these are osteocytes. They are located in pockets called lacunae. So the space where the osteocyte is located is called the lacunae. And then they form layers of concentric layers like this, layer 1, layer 2. They form layers of bone tissue called lamellae. Each layer is called a lamella. It's layers or sheets of bone tissue. And then the bone cells are alive, so they need to obtain oxygen and get rid of waste and obtain nutrients just like any other living cell. So there are channels from the lacuna where the bone cells reside to blood vessels. So the canaliculi are these little channels that you see. They radiate through the matrix of the bone and connect the lacuna to the blood vessels. All right, the basic functional unit of compact bone is called the osteon or Haversian system. Let me go back to that. Okay, this is an osteon. Under the microscope, that would be an osteon. That's a cross section of an osteon. An osteon actually is, you can see it better like this because it actually, it is circular if you look at it from above, but it's actually a cylinder that goes, that travels the length of the diaphysis. But it says a basic unit of compact bone is called the osteon. In an osteon, the osteocytes are arranged in concentric layers called lamellae. The layers all surround a central canal or Haversian canal, and that canal contains blood vessels. And then there are perforating canals along the sides here. These are perforating canals that run along the sides connecting to the blood vessels in the central canal. Okay, so what we see here is several osteons, and you can see that there's also bone tissue that fills in the spaces between the osteons. And I also want to point something out here too, is that the spongy bone, which is shown here, is composed of trabeculae, and trabeculae are all these different like rods or whatever you want to call them, that all these different pieces of bones that form that kind of spongy network of bone tissue. It's called trabeculae. So you would need to know that compact bone is composed of osteons and spongy bone is composed of trabeculae. Other characteristics of compact bone covers all bone surfaces except inside the joint capsules. So the surface of bone is always covered with a thin layer of compact bone, even though it might have mostly spongy bone. Like go back to the, okay, so right here along the edge, if my hands don't shake too bad, that edge is compact bone. Inside of the epiphysis is spongy bone, but all along the outside is compact bone. Articular cartilage protects bone surfaces at joints. So there's articular cartilage on the outside of the bone where it meets with another bone at a joint. The osteons are arranged parallel